What if the strangest figure ever carved into stone was never meant to be worshipped, but to disturb you at the deepest level of belief? Not to give answers, but to force a question most people avoid their entire lives. What exists between God and chaos? Long before theology was systematized, before doctrines were defined, before the early church drew its boundaries, there were objects small, silent, and unsettling passed through the ancient world. Among them were engraved gemstones, carried as talismans, etched with symbols that felt both sacred and forbidden. And among all those symbols, one figure refuses to be forgotten: Abraxas. Not because he fits into the categories of angel or demon, but because he breaks them completely. And the moment you truly see him, you realize this is not just mythology. This is a challenge to how reality itself is structured. Imagine holding one of these ancient stones in your hand. Its surface is worn, its edges smoothed by time, but the image remains unmistakable. A being with the body of a man, the head of a rooster, and legs formed from twisting serpents. In one hand, a whip. In the other, a shield. At first glance, it feels almost chaotic, even absurd, but that reaction fades the longer you look. Because nothing about this image is random. The rooster's head is not decorative, it is symbolic. In the ancient world, the rooster was the herald of dawn, the announcer of light breaking into darkness. It represented awakening, revelation, the moment hidden things become visible. The serpents are even older symbols, creatures tied to wisdom, danger, life, and death. They embody forces that cannot be fully controlled, only understood. And at the center, the human body standing between these extremes becomes the bridge between realms. This is not a monster. It is a message. Reality is not cleanly divided. It is layered, intertwined, and far more complex than simple categories of good and evil. And then, beside this image, there is a name: Abraxas, not just a label, but a code. In the ancient world, letters carried numerical value, and names were often equations waiting to be solved. When the letters of Abraxas are calculated, they form a number: 365, the number of days in a year, the full cycle of time itself. And suddenly, the image is no longer just symbolic, it becomes cosmological. This figure is not merely representing ideas. It is claiming authority over the structure of existence. Time, seasons, cycles, the rhythm of life itself, all tied to this mysterious name. And here, the tension begins to rise. Because if something governs the cycle of time, then where does that place God? Above it, beyond it, or separated from it in a way that changes everything we think we understand? This is where Abraxas becomes more than an image. He becomes a concept that reshapes theology. Because in the systems where he appears, he is not presented as a rival god in the traditional sense. He is something more unsettling, a mediator, a being positioned between the infinite and the material, between perfection and imperfection, a cosmic administrator overseeing the mechanics of existence. And suddenly, the strange hybrid form makes sense. He is not meant to be one thing, he is meant to represent the intersection of all things. A fusion of opposites, a symbol of a universe that is not simple, but structured in layers. And in that structure, the highest God is no longer immediately present. He becomes distant, hidden behind systems, separated from the physical world by intermediaries that govern its operation. This idea did not emerge out of rebellion, it emerged out of tension. A question that has echoed through every generation. If God is perfect, why is the world not? Why does suffering exist? Why does chaos seem to operate with such freedom? For some ancient thinkers, the traditional answers were not enough. They could not reconcile a flawless creator with a fractured reality, so they imagined something else, not a denial of God, but a reorganization of existence. What if the highest divine source was too pure to directly engage with the material world? What if there were layers between the divine and the physical beings or forces that shaped reality on behalf of a distant perfection? In that framework, Abraxas was not the source, but he was essential. The one who held the system together. The one who governed the cycles, the structure, the hidden machinery of existence. And this is the moment where everything begins to shift. Because once you introduce a layered cosmos, you introduce distance. God is no longer near, he is removed, abstract, beyond direct reach. And if that is true, then the path to truth changes. It is no longer about faith or relationship, it becomes about knowledge, hidden knowledge, secret understanding, insight that must be uncovered, decoded, earned. Abraxas, in this sense, becomes more than a symbol, he becomes a gateway, a key to accessing the deeper structure of reality. And that idea is powerful, because it appeals to something deeply human, the desire to understand what is hidden, to move beyond the surface, to feel like you are seeing what others cannot. But there is a subtle danger in that shift, because when truth becomes something hidden, layered behind symbols and systems, the focus begins to move. Instead of seeking the source, people begin to seek the structure. Instead of trusting in divine authority, they begin to navigate cosmic mechanisms. And without realizing it, the foundation changes. God is no longer central, he becomes distant. Reality is no longer simple, it becomes encoded. And the clarity of truth is replaced with the complexity of interpretation. Abraxas does not openly replace God, but he changes how God is perceived. And that shift, even if it seems small, alters everything. Because once God is seen as distant, everything else adjusts around that idea. Faith becomes intellectual. Prayer becomes uncertain. Authority becomes layered. And the simplicity of divine sovereignty of a God who is present, active, and supreme over all things becomes obscured by systems, hierarchies, and intermediaries. And yet, despite all of this, Abraxas remains compelling. Not because he offers clarity, but because he reflects a real struggle. The struggle to understand how perfection and imperfection can coexist. The struggle to make sense of a world that feels both ordered and chaotic at the same time. And that is why this image, carved into stone thousands of years ago, still matters. Because it is not just a relic of ancient belief, it is a doorway into a deeper question. A question about the nature of reality, the distance of God, and the structure of existence itself. But this is only the beginning, because what started as a symbol would soon become a system, a fully developed worldview that would challenge the early church in ways it was not prepared for. And at the center of that transformation was a man who took the mystery of Abraxas and turned it into something far more radical. His name was Basilides, and what he taught would force a confrontation between hidden knowledge and revealed truth, one that would shape the future of theology itself. What if the most dangerous idea in early Christianity wasn't persecution from the outside, but reinterpretation from within? Not the sword of empires, but the whisper of hidden knowledge. Because long before councils defined doctrine and creeds unified belief, there was a fracture forming beneath the surface, a quiet but powerful shift in how people understood God, reality, and their place within it. And at the center of that fracture stood a man whose ideas would push the mystery of Abraxas into something far more structured, far more persuasive, and far more destabilizing than a carved image on stone. His name was Basilides, and what he taught did not reject God, it redefined the distance between God and everything else. Basilides lived in a world where the tension we explored in Part 1 had reached a breaking point. The question was no longer theoretical, it was urgent. If God is perfect, infinite, and beyond corruption, then how do you explain a world filled with decay, suffering, and imperfection? For many early believers, the answer was simple. The world is fallen, but God remains sovereign within it. But for Basilides, that answer was not enough. It left too much unresolved, too much tension between divine perfection and material reality. So instead of simplifying the problem, he expanded the universe. Not physically, but metaphysically. He proposed a cosmos layered with levels of existence, each one further removed from the ultimate, unknowable God. And within that structure, Abraxas was no longer just a symbol, he became a central figure in the architecture of reality itself. In Basilides' vision, the highest God was so transcendent, so utterly beyond comprehension, that he could not be directly connected to the flawed material world. This God was not personal in the way Scripture describes, not relational, not immediate. Instead, he existed in absolute purity, beyond all categories, beyond all attributes, beyond even being itself. And from this unknowable source flowed a series of emanations, layers of existence, often described as heavens or realms, each one a step further away from divine perfection. According to some accounts, there were 365 of these levels, echoing the numerical value of Abraxas. And suddenly, the number we saw etched into stone was no longer symbolic, it became structural. A map of the cosmos, a system that explained everything from the movement of time to the existence of suffering. And here is where the shift becomes profound. Because in this system, the material world is not directly created by the highest God. It is the result of these lower emanations, beings, or forces that shape reality at a distance from the divine source. These are often described as rulers, powers, or archons, entities that govern different aspects of existence. And at the top of this vast hierarchy, overseeing the entire system, stands Abraxas, not as the ultimate God, but as the highest ruler within the created order, the one who holds together the 365 heavens, the one who governs the cycle of time and the structure of reality itself. And suddenly, the image from the gemstone is no longer abstract, it is a representation of authority, a visual expression of a cosmic administrator standing between the infinite and the material. Now pause here, because this is where the tension with biblical theology becomes impossible to ignore. In this framework, God is no longer directly involved in creation. He is too distant, too pure, too removed. The world we live in is shaped by intermediaries, layers of power that stand between humanity and the divine, and that changes everything. Because if God is distant, then access to Him is no longer immediate. It must be mediated, not through relationship but through knowledge, hidden knowledge, insight into the structure of the cosmos, understanding the layers, the rulers, the systems that govern existence. Salvation, in this view, is not about redemption from sin. It is about awakening from ignorance. It is about realizing the true nature of reality and finding a way to ascend through these layers, back toward the divine source. And this is the hook that made Basileid's teaching so compelling. Because it didn't ask people to abandon their questions, it gave those questions a framework. It acknowledged the complexity of the world, the presence of suffering, the feeling that something is not quite right, and instead of resolving that tension, it explained it. It told people the world feels broken because it is governed by lower powers. God feels distant because He is beyond this system. And the reason you feel disconnected is because you are trapped within layers of reality that you do not yet understand. But here's the promise: it doesn't have to stay that way. Through knowledge, through insight, through awakening, you can begin to see beyond the surface. You can navigate the structure. You can move closer to the divine. But there is a cost to that framework, and it is subtle enough that many don't see it at first. Because when salvation becomes knowledge, it becomes exclusive. Not everyone has access. Not everyone understands. Truth becomes something reserved for those who are initiated, those who are enlightened, those who can decode the system. And in that shift, something essential is lost. The idea of a God who is near, who is accessible, who reveals Himself not through complexity, but through clarity. The idea of grace freely given, not intellectually earned, begins to fade into the background. And in its place rises a system that feels powerful, intricate, and intellectually satisfying, but quietly distances humanity from the very God it claims to explain. This is why the early church did not see Basileides as just another teacher. Figures like Irenaeus recognized that this was not simply a different interpretation, it was a different foundation. Because the gospel proclaimed something radically different. It did not describe a distant God hidden behind layers of intermediaries. It proclaimed a God who entered into creation directly, a God who was not separated from the material world, but who stepped into it, a God whose authority was not distributed across a hierarchy of powers, but who held absolute sovereignty over all things seen and unseen. And in that framework, the entire system proposed by Basileides begins to collapse. Because if God is truly sovereign, then there is no need for a cosmic administrator like Abraxas. There is no need for 365 heavens separating humanity from the divine. There is no hidden structure that must be decoded to access truth. But here's where the conflict becomes more than theological, it becomes personal. Because the Basileidean vision appeals to something deeply human, the desire to understand the complexity of existence, to make sense of suffering, to believe that there is a hidden order behind the chaos. And in many ways, that desire is not wrong. The world is complex. Reality is layered. There are forces at work that we do not fully understand. But the question is not whether complexity exists. The question is how that complexity relates to God. Is it something that separates us from Him? Or is it something that exists under His authority? And this is the fracture, not just between two belief systems, but between two ways of seeing reality itself. One sees the universe as a layered system that must be navigated. The other sees it as a creation sustained by a sovereign God who is both transcendent and near. One places the burden on human understanding. The other places it on divine revelation. And at the center of that divide stands Abraxas, not as the ultimate answer, but as the symbol of the question. Because what Basilides did was not simply introduce a new idea, he redefined the problem. He took the tension between divine perfection and worldly imperfection and turned it into a system, a hierarchy, a map of existence that felt both logical and mysterious. And in doing so, he gave Abraxas a role that extended far beyond symbolism. He became the embodiment of a worldview that would challenge the early church for centuries to come. But the story doesn't end here, because this conflict would force a response. A clear, uncompromising assertion of what it means for God to be truly sovereign. Not distant, not layered, not mediated through hidden systems, but absolute. And in that response, the figure of Abraxas would be reinterpreted once again, not as a ruler, not as a mediator, but as something entirely different. And that shift would redefine the entire conversation. What if the greatest threat to truth isn't an obvious lie, but a system that feels almost true, close enough to resonate, structured enough to convince, complex enough to impress, and yet fundamentally misaligned at its core? Because by the time teachings like those of Basilides began to spread, the early church was no longer dealing with simple opposition. This was not persecution from outside forces. This was something far more subtle, a competing vision of reality that used familiar language, borrowed spiritual concepts, and yet quietly redefined the nature of God, authority, and salvation itself. And the response to that challenge would shape the foundation of Christian theology for centuries to come. At the center of this confrontation was a critical question: who truly holds authority over the universe? Is reality governed by layers of intermediaries, powers, rulers, archons, each controlling different aspects of existence? Or is there a single, sovereign God whose authority is absolute, immediate, and unmatched? Because the system proposed by Basilides did not deny God, it repositioned him. It placed him at such a distance that his direct involvement in the world became almost irrelevant. And in that space, a hierarchy emerged. A structured cosmos filled with beings like Abraxas, each playing a role in maintaining the order of existence. It was elegant. It was intricate. It explained complexity. But it also introduced something that the early church could not accept: divided authority. For early Christian leaders like Irenaeus, this was not a minor doctrinal disagreement. It was a direct challenge to the very heart of the gospel. Because the message they proclaimed was not built on layers or intermediaries, it was built on sovereignty. A God who does not share power. A creator who is not distant, not removed, not hidden behind systems, but actively sustaining all things. And more than that, a God who had entered into his own creation, not as a distant observer, but as a present reality. In that framework, the idea of a cosmic administrator like Abraxas becomes not just unnecessary, but incompatible. And here is where the confrontation sharpens. Because the biblical vision of reality does not deny the existence of powers or authorities beyond the physical world. It acknowledges them, but it places them in a completely different context. They are not independent rulers. They are not mediators standing between humanity and God. They are created beings, subject to a higher authority. And that authority is not layered or distributed. It is singular, absolute, unchallenged. This is the claim that cuts through the entire Gnostic framework. No matter how complex the universe appears, it does not operate outside the direct sovereignty of God. But here's the hook that makes this moment so powerful. The early church did not respond. By simplifying the universe, they responded by redefining authority within it. They did not say, "There are no powers." They said, "Those powers are not ultimate. They are not the source. They are not the final authority. They exist, but they exist under command." And that distinction changes everything, because it means that complexity does not equal independence. Layers do not equal separation. Mystery does not equal distance from God. This is where the figure of Abraxas begins to shift again. In the Gnostic system, he stands at the top of a vast hierarchy, governing the structure of time and existence. But in the biblical framework, any such power would be reclassified. Not as a ruler, but as a subject. Not as a mediator, but as something that itself is governed. And this reclassification is not just theological, it is deeply practical. Because it restores something that the Gnostic system quietly removes: direct access to God. Think about the difference for a moment. In a layered cosmos, every step toward the divine requires navigation, understanding, progression through levels of reality. But in a sovereign framework, access is not achieved, it is granted. Not through knowledge, but through relationship. Not through decoding the system, but through trust in the one who stands above it. And that idea is both radically simple and profoundly disruptive, because it removes the need for intermediaries. It removes the need for hidden knowledge. It removes the idea that truth is something you climb toward, and replaces it with the idea that truth is something revealed. And this is why the early church resisted so strongly. Because the Gnostic vision didn't just add complexity, it shifted dependence. It moved the focus from God's authority to the structure of the cosmos. It suggested that understanding the system was the key to salvation. But the gospel insisted on something else entirely. That salvation is not about escaping a system, it is about being restored to the source. And that source is not distant, not hidden, not beyond reach. It is present, active, sovereign over every layer, every power, every dimension of existence. Now here is where the tension becomes personal again. Because even today, the idea of a layered universe is deeply appealing. It feels sophisticated. It acknowledges mystery. It allows for complexity in a way that simple explanations often do not. And in a world that feels increasingly complicated, that kind of framework can feel more honest, more realistic. But the question remains, does complexity require divided authority? Or can a single, sovereign source sustain a universe that is both intricate and unified at the same time? This is the question that Abraxas forces us to confront. Not because he provides the answer, but because he represents the alternative. A universe governed by systems, layers, intermediaries. A reality where understanding replaces relationship. Where knowledge becomes the path to transcendence. And when placed against the biblical vision, the contrast becomes clear. One system elevates complexity as a pathway to truth. The other anchors truth in the authority of a sovereign God who is not diminished by complexity, but who governs it completely. And this is where the narrative begins to turn. Because once authority is reclaimed once, it is established that no power, no structure, no hierarchy exists outside the sovereignty of God. Then figures like Abraxas lose their central role. They are no longer necessary to explain reality. They are no longer gatekeepers of hidden knowledge. Instead, they become something else entirely. Not rulers, not mediators, but reflections, shadows, symbols that point not to themselves, but to the deeper question of how we understand power, mystery, and divine authority. And that shift opens the door to something unexpected. Because instead of asking whether Abraxas is real, the question becomes, what purpose does a figure like Abraxas serve in our understanding of God? Why does the idea persist? Why does it continue to surface across history, across cultures, across systems of thought? And what does that reveal not about the cosmos but about us? Because sometimes the most powerful symbols are not the ones that define truth, but the ones that force us to see it more clearly. And that is where the story moves next. Not into hierarchy, but into purpose. Not into systems, but into meaning. Because if Abraxas is not a rival, and not a ruler, then what is he? And why does his shadow still remain? What if the darkest symbols in human history were never meant to compete with the light, but to reveal it more clearly, not as enemies of truth, but as contrasts that sharpen it? Because by now, the figure of Abraxas has been stripped of his illusion of authority. No longer a cosmic ruler, no longer a necessary mediator, no longer the architect of reality. But he has not disappeared, and that raises a deeper, more unsettling question. If a figure like Abraxas is not essential to the structure of the universe, why does he persist? Why does the human mind continue to produce, revisit, and reinterpret symbols that blur the line between light and darkness? Because here is the truth most people overlook. Abraxas survives not because of what he is, but because of what he represents. He embodies the tension we cannot escape, the intersection of opposites, the uncomfortable reality that the world is not experienced in absolutes, but in contrasts. And instead of resolving that tension, Abraxas holds it in place. He forces you to look at both sides at once. Not just light, but shadow. Not just order, but chaos. And in doing so, he becomes something unexpected, not a god. Not even a being in the traditional sense, but a mirror. And here is where the shift happens. Because once you stop asking whether Abraxas is real, and start asking what role he plays in perception, everything changes. He is no longer a threat to divine authority. He becomes a tool that reveals how we understand that authority. Because the existence of shadow concepts, whether they are mythological, symbolic, or philosophical does not diminish the idea of a sovereign God. If anything, it amplifies it. Because a truly sovereign authority is not threatened by contrast, it defines it. Think about that for a moment. Light is not understood in isolation, it is understood because darkness exists. Order is not appreciated unless chaos is possible. Clarity is not meaningful unless confusion can occur. And in that sense, the presence of complex, even unsettling symbols in human history does not weaken truth, it gives it dimension. It gives it depth. It allows it to be recognized, not just stated. And this is where Abraxas takes on a new role. Not as a ruler of opposites, but as a representation of the human attempt to reconcile them. But here's the hook that most people miss. The danger was never the symbol itself. It was the elevation of the symbol into authority. When Abraxas is seen as a governing force, he distorts reality. But when he is understood as a reflection of human struggle, he clarifies it. He exposes the desire to understand the world not just as it is, but as it feels layered, contradictory, complex. And that desire is not inherently wrong. It becomes dangerous only when it replaces the source of truth with the interpretation of it. Because in a framework of divine sovereignty, nothing exists outside of purpose. Not even confusion, not even complexity, not even the symbols we struggle to understand. They are not independent forces, they are part of a larger reality that is ultimately governed by a single, unified authority. And that means even the existence of ideas, like Abraxas, can be understood, not as threats, but as expressions of a deeper question. How do we make sense of a world that feels both ordered and chaotic at the same time? And this is where the perspective begins to mature. Because instead of trying to eliminate mystery, it begins to place it correctly, not as something that separates us from God, but as something that exists within a reality he fully governs. Mystery does not imply distance. Complexity does not imply fragmentation. And the presence of symbolic shadow does not imply a competing power. It simply reveals that our understanding is limited, while the structure of reality is not. Now pause here, because this is where everything becomes personal again. Because the same tension that produced Abraxas in the ancient world still exists today. People still wrestle with the same questions. Why does suffering exist? Why does the world feel fractured? Why does reality seem to operate on levels we cannot fully grasp? And in response, modern culture has created its own versions of Abraxas, not always in the form of mythological figures, but in ideas, systems, theories that attempt to explain everything by layering complexity on top of complexity. And just like before, those systems are compelling. They offer depth. They acknowledge mystery. They give the impression that truth is something hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered by those who look deeply enough. But the risk remains the same. Because when complexity becomes the focus, clarity begins to fade. And when understanding becomes the goal, trust begins to weaken. Not intentionally, but gradually, quietly. This is why reframing Abraxas matters. Because it allows us to see the difference between symbol and source, between reflection and reality, between the human attempt to understand and the divine authority that actually governs. And once that distinction is clear, something shifts. The need to decode everything begins to loosen. The pressure to navigate hidden systems begins to fade. And in its place, a different kind of understanding emerges, one that does not deny complexity, but is not controlled by it either. Because the existence of shadow does not threaten the light, it reveals it. And the presence of tension does not weaken truth, it sharpens it. And in that sense, Abraxas strange, unsettling, impossible to categorize serves a purpose far different from what he was originally believed to hold. Not as a ruler of the cosmos, but as a reminder of how easily the human mind can elevate mystery above meaning. And here is the final hook for this part. What if the true danger was never Abraxas himself, but the instinct to place something, anything between ourselves and the source of truth? Not necessarily a figure carved in stone, but a system, an idea, a structure that feels necessary to explain what we don't understand. Because once that instinct takes hold, the distance begins, not imposed from above but created from within. And that realization leads us to the final stage of this journey. Because even though Abraxas has been reframed, his story is not over. His image did not remain in ancient stones. It did not disappear with the early church. Instead, it evolved. It moved. It reappeared in places no one expected, in philosophy, in psychology, in the modern obsession with hidden knowledge and deeper realities. And that raises one final question. If Abraxas is no longer a god, why does he keep coming back? What if the most ancient symbols never truly disappear, they just change form? Not erased by time, not defeated by theology, but absorbed, reinterpreted, and reintroduced in ways that feel new, even when they are not. Because if you think the story of Abraxas ended in the early centuries of the Church, buried alongside forgotten sects and broken systems of thought, then you've missed something critical. He didn't vanish. He evolved. And his return did not come through religion, but through the human mind itself. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The theological battles that once defined the early church faded into history. But the questions that gave rise to Abraxas never left. They couldn't, because they were never really about him. They were about something deeper, the tension between order and chaos, light and darkness, the known and the unknowable. And wherever that tension exists, the need to symbolize it follows. The need to give it form, to name it, to understand it. And that is exactly where Abraxas found new life, not as a deity, but as an idea waiting to be rediscovered. That rediscovery came in an unexpected place: modern psychology. In the work of Carl Jung, a thinker who was not interested in reviving ancient religions, but in understanding the structure of the human psyche. Jung explored symbols not as literal truths, but as expressions of the unconscious fragments of meaning that reveal how the human mind grapples with reality. And when he encountered the figure of Abraxas, he did not dismiss it as myth. He recognized it as something far more significant, a symbol of totality, a representation of the union of opposites, not just good or evil, not just light or darkness, but both, held together in a single, unsettling image. And here's where the story takes a profound turn. Because in Jung's interpretation, Abraxas is not a being that exists out there in the cosmos. He is a reflection of what exists within us. The human struggle to reconcile contradictions. The desire to integrate the parts of ourselves that feel divided. The recognition that reality, as we experience it, is not simple. It is layered, paradoxical, often uncomfortable. And Abraxas, in this framework, becomes a psychological mirror. Not a ruler of heavens, but a representation of the internal complexity we all carry. Now pause here, because this is where the modern world reconnects with the ancient one. The language has changed, the framework has shifted, but the core idea remains. The belief that beneath the surface of reality, there is something deeper, something hidden, something that must be understood, not just accepted. And this is why Abraxas continues to appear not just in academic thought, but in culture itself, in literature, in art, in digital spaces where people search for meaning beyond what is visible. He becomes part of a larger pattern, a recurring symbol in humanity's ongoing attempt to decode existence. But here's the hook that makes this so relevant today. We live in an age obsessed with hidden knowledge, algorithms, encrypted systems, conspiracy theories, layers of information beneath information. The idea that truth is not obvious, but buried. That it must be uncovered, pieced together, discovered by those willing to look deeper than everyone else. And in that environment, the spirit of Abraxas thrives. Not as a name people openly worship, but as a mindset. A way of seeing the world as something encoded, something that requires insight to truly understand. And just like in the ancient world, that mindset is both compelling and dangerous, because it acknowledges something real, the complexity of existence. But it also risks distorting something essential, the clarity of truth. When everything becomes layered, nothing feels certain. When every answer leads to another hidden question, the search never ends. And without realizing it, the pursuit of understanding becomes an endless loop, always reaching deeper, but never arriving. This is where the connection to the past becomes impossible to ignore. Because this same instinct that led to the creation of Abraxas in ancient times is still active today. The instinct to explain the tension of reality by building systems around it. To take what is mysterious and turn it into something structured, something navigable, and in doing so, to place that structure between ourselves and the source of truth. Not intentionally, but inevitably. Because here's the deeper truth. The human mind is not comfortable with unresolved tension. It seeks patterns. It seeks meaning. It seeks explanations that make the world feel coherent. And when simple answers feel insufficient, it reaches for complexity, for layers, for systems that promise to explain everything. And that is where symbols like Abraxas find their power, not in their reality, but in their ability to satisfy that need. But satisfaction is not the same as truth. And this is where the final shift must happen. Because after tracing Abraxas from ancient stones to modern psychology, from mystical systems to digital culture, one thing becomes clear. The symbol endures, but its meaning changes depending on how it is used. It can be a tool for reflection or a distraction from reality. It can reveal the complexity of human perception or obscure the simplicity of divine authority. And this brings us back to the central message that has been building from the very beginning. Not about Abraxas himself, but about what he points to. Because every version of this symbol, every reinterpretation, every system built around it, ultimately circles back to the same question. Where does truth come from? Is it something we construct through understanding? Or is it something that exists independently of us, waiting to be revealed? Because if truth is something we must construct, then the search never ends. There is always another layer, another system, another interpretation. But if truth is rooted in a sovereign source, one that exists beyond our ability to fully comprehend, but is not hidden from us, then the search changes. It is no longer about building upward through complexity, but about recognizing what has already been made clear. And this is the final contrast that Abraxas helps expose, not by providing the answer, but by highlighting the difference between two paths, one that moves deeper into systems, symbols, and hidden structures, and one that moves toward clarity, authority, and a truth that does not need to be decoded to be real. Because in the end, Abraxas is not the destination. He is the detour, a reflection of the human tendency to complicate what may already be complete. And that realization leads us to the final part of this journey. Because once the symbol is understood, once the pattern is recognized, there is only one question left to answer. Not about Abraxas, but about where you choose to look for truth, and whether you are searching through layers or returning to the source. What if, after everything, after the symbols, the systems, the layers of interpretation, the truth was never hidden to begin with? Not buried beneath complexity, not locked behind secret knowledge, not reserved for those who can decode reality, but present, clear, unmoved by the centuries of speculation built around it. Because after tracing Abraxas from ancient stones to philosophical systems, from Gnostic hierarchies to modern psychology, one reality begins to stand apart from everything else. The symbol changes, but the question does not. And more importantly, the answer does not need to. Because here is the final tension that must be confronted. Not between light and darkness, not between good and evil, but between two fundamentally different ways of approaching truth. One that assumes truth is hidden, layered, and must be discovered through increasing complexity. And one that assumes truth originates from a sovereign source, one that is not diminished by mystery, not obscured by creation, and not dependent on human understanding to remain true. This is the divide that has been present from the very beginning. The same divide that gave rise to Abraxas, the same divide that shaped the teachings of Basilides, the same divide that continues today in a world obsessed with deeper meaning, hidden structures, and unseen realities. Because the more complex the world appears, the more tempting it becomes to believe that truth itself must also be complex, that it must be hidden beneath layers, waiting to be uncovered by those who search hard enough. But here's the hook that changes everything. Complexity in creation does not require complexity in authority. A universe can be vast, intricate, and filled with layers of existence and still be governed by a single, unified source. Mystery does not imply fragmentation. Depth does not imply distance. And the existence of things we do not fully understand does not mean that truth itself is beyond reach. It simply means that our perspective is limited, not that the source is hidden. And this is where the concept of divine sovereignty becomes more than a theological statement. It becomes the anchor that holds everything together. Because if God is truly sovereign, then nothing exists outside of his authority. Not systems, not symbols, not powers, not even the ideas we create to try to understand reality. Everything seen and unseen, simple and complex, light and shadow exists within a framework that is ultimately unified under a single origin. And in that framework, Abraxas finds his final place. Not as a ruler, not as a mediator, not as a necessary part of the system, but as a reminder of what happens when the human mind encounters mystery and tries to resolve it without anchoring itself to the source of truth. A reminder of how easily complexity can become a substitute for clarity, and a reminder that symbols, no matter how powerful they appear, are never the origin. They are reflections of the questions we carry. Now pause here, because this is where the journey becomes personal one last time. Because everything we've explored, every layer, every system, every reinterpretation leads back to a choice. Not a choice about what to believe regarding an ancient figure, but a choice about how to approach reality itself. Do you see the world as something that must be decoded, navigated, and understood through increasingly complex frameworks? Or do you see it as something that, while complex, is ultimately grounded in a truth that does not change, does not shift, and does not require endless interpretation to remain real? Because the path you choose shapes everything that follows. If truth is hidden, then you will always be searching, always looking for the next layer, the next insight, the next piece of knowledge that brings you closer but never fully arrives. But if truth is rooted in a sovereign origin, then the search is not about climbing upward, it is about recognizing what is already there. Not about uncovering something new, but about seeing clearly what has always been present. And this is where the story of Abraxas reaches its conclusion, not by answering every question, but by reframing the one that matters most. Not what is Abraxas, but why do we need him? Why do we feel the need to place something between ourselves and the source? Why do we reach for systems when faced with mystery? Why does complexity feel more convincing than clarity? Because once those questions are faced honestly, the symbol begins to lose its power. Not because it is disproven, but because it is understood. It is no longer a key to hidden knowledge. It is no longer a gateway to deeper reality. It is simply a reflection of a human instinct, the instinct to complicate what we do not immediately understand. And here is the final hook, the one that lingers after everything else fades. What if the garden was never the limitation, but the clarity? What if the truth we keep trying to move beyond is not something to escape, but something we were meant to remain within? Not in ignorance, but in alignment. Not in simplicity as weakness, but in simplicity as truth. Because the moment we step beyond that clarity in search of something more, we risk creating systems, symbols, and structures that feel profound but quietly move us further from the source they claim to explain. And that is the final revelation. Abraxas was never the answer. He was the question. A question about power, mystery, and the nature of reality itself. But the answer does not lie in the symbol. It lies in the source. The one authority that does not shift, does not fragment, and does not hide behind layers of complexity. The one truth that governs both the garden and the stars. And the moment you see that clearly, you no longer need to look beyond it. What if the most important truth was never hidden, but simply overlooked? Because after everything we've uncovered, every symbol, every system, every layer of mystery, one reality remains untouched, not rewritten, not replaced, not buried by time or interpretation. Unmoved. And that should raise a question that doesn't go away when the video ends. If truth has always been there, why do we keep looking beyond it? Maybe it's not because truth is hard to find. Maybe it's because simplicity is hard to accept. Because a truth that doesn't require decoding doesn't give us control. A truth that doesn't need layers doesn't elevate our understanding above others. And a truth that is already clear forces us to respond, not just analyze. So we build systems. We chase symbols. We search for something deeper, even when depth isn't what we're missing. And that's why figures like Abraxas never truly disappear. Because they reflect something inside us. Not a hidden reality, but a hidden instinct. The instinct to move beyond what is given in search of something that feels greater. But here's the final thought I want to leave you with. What if going beyond the garden was never the goal, but the beginning of confusion? What if the truth you're searching for isn't waiting in another layer, but in what has already been revealed? And if that's true, then the real question isn't what lies beyond, but why we keep trying to go there. If this made you question something deeper than expected, you don't ignore that. Because most people don't search for truth, they scroll past it. So before you leave, subscribe. Not for answers, but for the questions that actually matter. And if you're ready to go further, there's another story waiting. One that doesn't just challenge what you believe, but why you believe it. Because the next mystery is even more unsettling. What if the one sin that can never be forgiven is not what you think it is?